Good morning. How are y'all this morning? Other than freezing cold, I'm sure. Very nice, yes. You may have seen I'm knitting and I'm doing a hat, and I really wish I was a lot further along on it than I am because I could really use a hat or some gloves or something today. And it is, I think, just this room, and none of the other rooms I've been presenting in are nearly as cold. Anyway, let's talk about gainful employment update instead of how freezing I am. So today we're going to talk about the regulations, which programs are gainful employment programs, reporting, metrics, and certifications. We're not going to talk a lot about disclosures. There's a whole nother session on that, which actually is happening immediately after this one over in the exhibit hall. So as you guys probably all know, the final rule was published in October 31st, 2014. It went into effect July 1st, 2015. The new disclosures had a delayed effective date, so they are not going into effect until this January. However, your disclosures that you had to do from the 2010 rule, those regulations were still in place the entire time, so everybody should have disclosures using the department's template up on your website. We did a Dear Colleague letter, 15-12. Was posted June 30th, 2015. It's kind of long, about 12 pages, but it's a good read. I highly recommend you all read it. So before we talk a lot more about what is in the regulations, let's talk about which programs it applies to. So you all know that according to the Higher Education Act, to be Title IV eligible, the program has to be long enough, it has to have state and accreditor recognition. There's a number of things that a program has to be in order to be eligible for Title IV aid. In general, Title IV aid can only go to programs where the institution offers a degree, if it's a nonprofit or public institution, or it leads to gainful employment in a recognized occupation at any type of institution. So these would be certificate programs, diploma programs, and also degree programs at for-profit institutions. So all certificate and diploma programs, whether you're nonprofit, public, whatever, are gainful employment programs, and you're required to follow these regulations. Now, there are a few small exceptions to the rule that all programs offered by your institution have to lead to some sort of certificate from your school, certificate or degree, some sort of credential. But there are only a few of them, and if your program does lead to a certificate, it is a gainful employment program. If you have any questions about specific programs, please feel free to talk to me afterwards. There's also a lot of good information in electronic announcement number 53. It explains pretty well and lists the exceptions about what programs are gainful employment programs. There's also a section in the GE operations manual. It's in the overview section of that document that also covers the same information just in a little different way. So now let's spend a minute talking about reporting to NSLDS. So reporting to NSLDS was due July 31st, 2015. That was 5 years worth of data. So hopefully you all did that. And then it's due, the most recently completed award year is due every October 1st. So 14-15 was due October 1st, 2015, 15-16, October 1st, 2016, and so on. It is Title IV students only. And it will be October 1st going forward. There aren't a lot of changes to the formats, and there haven't been in recent years. After that initial reporting, we made a few small tweaks, but I don't anticipate any changes in the reporting formats. So there was a lot of data, especially that first 5-year group of data is a lot of data, and then subsequently, there's been a couple more years since then. And initially, the department sent some letters to your presidents if the reporting was incomplete or not done on time. And some schools got referred to administrative action for if it wasn't done. There will be more letters that will be coming out at some point. So I would encourage you to make sure that all of your reporting, especially for the couple most recent years, 14, 15, 15, 16, that all that data is in and is complete. So let's talk a minute about data quality. So it's really important that all the information that you provide to the department is complete, accurate, and consistent. So completeness means, did you report all of the students, all the Title IV students in the program you were supposed to report? Did you report all the information for those students? You know, there's some additional information if the student withdraws or completes the program, then you also have to report the amount of tuition and fees that they got for the entire program, any institutional debt that they have at the time they leave the program, and institutional debt, and private loans. So there are a couple additional elements that you report if the student's either withdrawn or has completed. Is the information you completed accurate? And you'd be surprised how many schools are even, this week telling me, oh, we didn't report that correctly. Okay, so go back and fix it. As Jeff Baker said in the federal update, you can still fix your old reporting data. Now, it's not going to affect your rates for this time around because, you were supposed to have reported accurately to the department in the first place, and then we gave you an opportunity to correct it. Any error reports you get from NSLDS are supposed to be corrected and resubmitted within 10 days. And we've sent out several electronic announcements saying, hey, make sure you get your reporting in. We're about to run the rates. You also had a corrections period before we sent the data to Social Security Administration. So for this year's rates, that opportunity has passed. However, the data that is used will be used for other things. It'll be used for disclosure metrics. It only goes forward 1 year, like the 2-year cohort only moves forward 1 year. So that data will be used for debt to earnings metrics going forward as well. So it really behooves you to go ahead and get your data corrected. And you can still do that. And then of course there's consistency. We want to make sure that you are reporting the same information to NSLDS and COD. If you say the student's in a particular zip code credential level program, then you should be reporting that same zip code to COD that you're reporting to NSLDS, and it's on your e-car, and it should all be consistent. So data quality reviews. This is when you review your data for completeness, accuracy, and consistency, and you should do this fairly consistently and regularly because it's always easier to correct problems the earlier you catch them. And this is particularly true for gainful employment because if you find a problem now and you fix it now before we run the rates for next year, it'll be much easier to correct than if you have to go through the 45-day correction process. And both data quality and security is something that the department is going to be stepping up our enforcement efforts in the next year. And Jeff Baker, I think, mentioned this at the general session, but it definitely bears repeating. Data quality and security is something the department is going to be stepping up our enforcement efforts in the next year. So it's really important that any data you provide to the department, whether it's gainful employment or enrollment reporting or anything, is correct. It's important to know that as we move forward in calculating the debt to earnings, that when we basically froze the file. We pulled like what we're going to do for debt to earnings. We sent it to Social Security Administration, and we froze the file. So any corrections that you make, either to the frozen file for a corrections period, or which you did back in July, or you're making to the debt to earnings calculation for Title IV debt, those are only going to correct this frozen file that we have pulled for this year's debt to earning calculation. It doesn't go back and correct the data in NSLDS, so you still have to do that. So if we accepted your corrections and you think, okay, great, they added the students I'd forgotten to submit and they changed the institutional debt for the one that I messed up on, we're good going forward. You still have to go back into NSLDS and fix that data so that it will continue to be correct going forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the debt to earnings measures.
Thank you, Cynthia. Just going to go over briefly what the process is for the debt to earnings rates. As Cynthia already pointed out, schools did a lot of initial reporting that was done by July 31st. There's an additional year reporting that was done by October. And based on that reporting, the department issued completers lists to schools, which schools then subsequently corrected. And we used the completer list to obtain earnings data from SSA. And based on the earnings data, we calculated the draft debt to earnings rates, which were distributed to schools and which are now going through a challenge process. And we hope to issue final rates sometime in January. Now, before I talk about the mechanics of calculating a debt to earnings rate for a program, I think it's good to talk about what a debt to earnings rate for an individual or a student might be. And what we're talking about is the debt that a student has to pay over the course of a year based on their earnings. So it's annual debt over annual earnings, and it's really a gauge or a measure of a student's ability to service that debt or to make payments on their loans. Now, how that translates into a metric for a program is we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So the first thing we're going to talk about is who's included in this metric. And we include students who completed the program. We don't include students who didn't complete. And we use two different periods. We use a 2-year period or a 2-year cohort, and we use a 4-year cohort. For the 2-year, we use a 2-year cohort anytime we have 30 or more students who completed the program in that 2-year period. If less than 30 students completed a program, then we go to a 4-year cohort to try to get up to 30. And you can think of 30 as a critical mass. So when we calculate a debt to earnings rate for a program, it has some substance, it has some validity. If even going to a 4-year period, we still have fewer than 30 students, then we simply don't calculate a debt to earnings rate for a program, and the program can continue just the way it is, no problem. Now, the 2-year cohort is students who completed a program in the 3rd and 4th award year prior to the award year for which we're calculating the rate. For the 4-year cohort, we tack on 2 additional years, the 5th and the 6th year. So an example would be for the 2014-15, the rates calculated for that award year, the 2-year cohort period is 2010-11 and 11 and 12, and then we add 08-09 and 09-10 for the 4-year cohort. Now, the rules provide that we would exclude certain students from the calculation. So even though we know who the student completers are for a particular program, through no fault of the school or the program, you could have situations where a student is unable or unlikely to be able to make payments on their loan, and in those circumstances, we'll exclude those students from the calculation. Excuse me. And those students would be any students whose loans are in a military-related deferment, any loans that the department has discharged or considering for a discharge for total and permanent disability, students that are enrolled in another eligible program during the year for which we're obtaining earnings data from the Social Security Administration. And then any student essentially who completes a higher credential program at an institution. And the last one is in the unfortunate event that the student died, and obviously won't count that student. Now this slide shows the calculation of the debt to earnings rates, and there's two metrics that we use. The first one is what we call discretionary income rate. And if you remember back to the individual student, you have an annual loan payment. In this case, it represents the annual loan payment for the program, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that's divided by annual earnings, or a modified annual earnings. And again, that's annual earnings for the program, which we'll talk about later. But in any event, for discretionary income, we subtract from annual earnings an amount equal to 150% of the poverty guideline for a single individual. The reason for the subtraction is that the subtracted amount represents a minimum amount of subsistence needed for the student or the individual to survive. So part of that income is protected. The remaining part of the earnings are used or can be used to make loan payments. Under the annual earnings rate, there's no modifications. It's simply the annual loan payment divided by annual earnings. Now this chart shows what the threshold amounts are for determining whether a program passes or fails the debt to earnings metrics. So for the annual debt to earnings metrics, a program passes if the debt to earnings rate is less than or equal to 8%. For the discretionary income rate, the program passes if the rate is equal to or less than 20%. Now going down to the last row, a program fails if the annual debt to earnings rate is 12% or there's zero income, or in the discretionary side if it's 30% or more or there's zero income. So you see the pass and the fail. We've created in the regulations a category called the zone, in which a program is neither passing or failing, but a program that scores in the zone remains eligible for Title IV funds for up to a 4-year period. So during that period, a program could either fail or be in the zone, but it can't do that for more than 4 consecutive years. After that, it becomes ineligible. Now, on the fail side, if a program fails, flat out fails 2 out of 3 consecutive years, it loses its Title IV eligibility. Now, getting back to the annual loan payment for a program, the way that we calculate that is we take the median loan debt of all the students who completed the program. So we'll show you an example of that. So we'll take the median loan debt of those students, and we'll amortize that over a period of years at a specified interest rate. For example, we'll take, let's say the median loan debt is $20,000, and the loan period is 10 years at 6.5%. So we'll do that calculation, and we'll determine what the annual payment is based on that median loan debt. So there's some peculiarities in calculating the median loan debt, and I'll go over those too. And for the median loan debt, typically for each student, we'll include the student's Title IV loans, we'll include private loans, and we'll include any institutional debt. All of that is considered as part of the debt. Now, we'll compare that total debt to the actual charges that the student was assessed for tuition and fees, books, equipment, and supplies. So in cases where the amount assessed the student for tuition and fees and other items is less than the total debt incurred, we'll take that amount. But in either case, we'll take the lower of the two figures as the debt for an individual student, and we'll do that on a student-by-student basis. That'll be more clear on the next slide. The other adjustment that we make is that if you go back to the completers list that was sent to SSA, so what we'll get from SSA is the median and mean earnings of the students on that completer list. They won't give us individual earnings for students, so we don't have that information. We only have means and medians. Now, what may happen is that Social Security may be unable to match the earnings for a student on the list. So if that happens, SSA tells us about it, and we go back to the median debt list that we developed for the completers, and we remove the highest debt on that completers list to compensate for the fact that we don't know what the earnings are for a particular student. So we'll remove that. And then after we make these exclusions and we make these adjustments, then we'll calculate the median debt for the program based on the remaining amounts. And that's illustrated in the next slide. So if you pretend that this was the cohort of students that we're talking about, you can see that for Amy, SSA was unable to match or to obtain earnings for that student, so we're excluding Amy. For all of the other students, you can see that we're comparing the actual debt to the assessed charges for the student on an individual basis and taking the lower amount. So the last column indicates the lower amount, and based on that last column, we'll calculate the median debt. Excuse me. And the median debt is simply the middle value. So the middle value in this case is $25,000. Okay, so circling back a little bit on determining a debt for an individual student, we could have cases, and we do have cases, where a student is enrolled in more than one GE program at a school at the same time for the same loan period. And in that case, we attribute the loan amounts to each program based on the number of days that the student attended each program. So in the simple case where the student attends a program equally, it's a 50-50 split. Otherwise, we do the ratios and assign the proportions accordingly. Now, in instances where a student is enrolled in a GE program at a school and a non-GE program, we attribute the loan to the GE program on the assumption that the student would have borrowed that money anyway to attend the GE program. Okay, so getting back to the calculation for the annual loan payment, again, this is just an overview again. We've calculated median loan debt. We've included Title IV, educational loans, private loans, institutional debt. We've capped the amount of the loan debt to tuition and fees. In essence, we've done the comparison, total loan debt versus assessed charges, and we've taken the lower amount. And we amortize the remaining, or the median loan debt for the program over a specified number of years, depending on the credential level and the interest rate that's applicable to that group of students. On the earnings side, again, we obtain mean and median earnings figures from SSA, and we use those mean and median figures, and we take the highest one. So whatever we get back from SSA, if mean or median is higher, whichever one it is, we take the highest earnings amount to calculate both the discretionary and the annual debt to earnings rates. Okay. So in essence, by taking means and medians to calculate the rate, we're attempting to determine what the debt to earnings rate is for a typical student that's attending a GE program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cynthia.
Thanks, John. So now that you kind of understand how we do the math to get to the debt to earnings rates, and you want to know what your results are. So before you decide whether or not to do a challenge, this is how you would review your results in NSLDS. You can access this view by selecting GE Debt Measures under the Org tab on NSLDS. The picture on the left is an overview of the program's rates. You'll notice the red circles with Fs besides failing scores. Remember, we take the best score that a program earned. So if a program had a debt to earning annual score that was failing, but the discretionary score was passing, the program passes, because we take the best one that we have. For this particular example, all 4 of the rates failed, both the debt to earnings annual, debt to earnings discretionary, and then the transitional rates as well. If you click on one of those blue number squares next to any individual program, it'll take you to the debt measures detail page, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. In the cohort column, we tell you whether we use the 2-year cohort or 4-year cohort. And again, as John had said, that's based on whether or not you had at least 30 students in the 2-year cohort. And if not, then we'd use the 4-year cohort. And we tell you the numerator and the denominator, and what the program score is, and whether it's pass, zone, or fail. So the first one you see has a Z for zone, the next one's pass. And again, you get the best score. And you might be wondering why these rates have some NAs for the transitional. And the reason why that is because transitional rates are a second chance of sort. We use the same earnings that we got from SSA, but we use a new group of students to do the debt. So it's the most recently completed award year. It's only a 1-year cohort. And we look at those students and come up with a new median debt under the theory that you guys might have made some changes to the program in order to reduce tuition and fees, let's say. You reduce tuition fees in order to pass the debt to earnings measure. For these, you need to have at least 10 students in the cohort in order for us to give you a transitional rate. So you might have an NA because you had less than 10 in the transitional rate. You also might have an NA because the program passed. And if the program passed, we're not going to calculate transitional rates because it's already passing. You don't need the second chance. So once you see what your rates are, you may decide to do a challenge on them. So here's the timeline for the challenges for this year. We gave you the earnings data on October 9th, and there wasn't anything to challenge related to that. We just gave it to you guys ahead of it going public. It has since gone public. It's available at the FSA Data Center. And then the night of October 19th, we gave you the GE draft backup data that was distributed to schools, and that started the 45-day challenge period. We actually started on October 24th, so we started at a few, we gave you the data and then over the weekend, and then we started it the next week. December 7th at 11:59 p.m. is the end of the challenge period for the draft debt to earnings rates. All challenges and all supporting documentation must be submitted to the department no later than December 7th. So there were actually 2 corrections in challenge periods. The first one was where you had yet another opportunity to correct data that the school reported. And we already completed that. That happened back in July. So now we're in the process, the 45-day window, where you're correcting Title IV debt. And we're only going to briefly go over this here, so I wanted to make sure you're aware of there's other resources. Probably the best resources on challenging the data would be the webinars that we did, and those are available at the data center. So these are the items that you can challenge at this time. It's the loan period begin and end date, the loan amount, any cancellation amount, and any refund amount. These are the items in this red box on the slide. And you can only challenge these items if you have proof that they are wrong. So you need to have some sort of documentation, whether it's from elsewhere within NSLDS, from the loan servicer, from COD, somewhere. You need to have some documentation. And we put out an electronic announcement with a very long attachment that talks about the types of acceptable and unacceptable documentation. I will make one more note here about refund amount, because I've had a few schools that have tried to say that credit balances are refund and put in that there. Don't do that. That is not a refund. A refund is when within 120 days, the student declines the loan, you give the money back to the loan holder or back to the servicer if it's a direct loan. It is not a case where, and usually that's done as a cancellation actually with a direct loan, but a refund was what you used for FEL when you were giving the money back to the FEL lender. It is not a credit balance that goes to the student. The student still borrowed that money. So when you go on the NSLDS Financial Aid Professional website, you will be working with the GE tab, as you can see in the screenshot at the top. Under GEDE list, you can see your draft results on the page, and those are the pages that we went over earlier. You can also get to the update page to begin entering in data for any challenges. So this is similar to what we did for the corrections process. And if you'll remember, updating and confirming a loan does not submit the information to the department. There's a second step that you have to do. So once you've entered all the individual challenges to the Title IV debt that you have to do, then you have to go to another page and submit the entire program to the department. So we know these are all the challenges that you're going to make for a particular program, and we can start working that particular case. But make sure you have made any challenges to that program that you intend to make before you hit the submit button. So, because once you hit that final submit, then you're done, and you can't go back and make any additional corrections to that particular, or challenges to that particular program. And you absolutely have to get this done by December 7th at 11:59 p.m. because we will not be accepting any challenges after that time. As of Monday, we had about 21 programs at 12 schools that had completed the process, gone in, went to their program, and hit the final submit button to send it to the department. We had about another 27 programs at 17 schools that had started the process but had not hit the final submit button. So if you were one of the schools that did go in and at least do some challenges, you have till December 7th, but if you're done with them, you should go in and make sure you do that final submit. So we've included just a quick overview of the process, and there are, as I mentioned earlier, lots of different resources and electronic announcements and other documents that will help you with this process. Electronic announcement number 94 is particularly helpful. You can find that on the GE information page. There's also a couple webinars that we did that Eric Mellis and our NSLDS staff did. He's great, and I think those were both very helpful webinars. You might want to review them. Both the webinar recordings and transcripts are all online. And I'd like to remind y'all of one other thing, which is that the challenges are only if this information is actually incorrect and you have some proof that it's incorrect. I've had a couple schools that have said that they didn't like their debt to earnings rates and therefore wanted to do a challenge. And although I appreciate that, without proof that it's actually wrong, like an individual loan amount is wrong, you can't just submit a challenge because you don't like it or you think the student shouldn't have borrowed as much as they did or something. As John had mentioned, we do take the lesser of the loan amount or the tuition fees, books and supplies and equipment. So if the concern is just, oh, well, the student didn't use that money at my school, they used it for living expenses, we take that into account in the calculation because we take the lesser of the tuition fees, books, supplies, and equipment versus the loan amount, but that isn't something that you challenge as part of this process. And now I'm going to take a really quick to talk about certifications. So you guys all did your transitional certifications on December 31st, and that process went pretty well. We had a few schools that had to redo them a couple times, but in general, it all went pretty well. You will redo your certifications when you redo your EAP and recertify everything. But you also need to redo your certifications anytime something materially changes. So if you add a program, if the requirements for a program change, you're going to have to do a new certification for that. So let's say you're going to add a new program. Your president or CEO will certify, number one, that the program is approved by your accrediting agency and state. Pretty easy. You'd have to do that for any new program anyway. Number two, it's programmatically accredited if the state or federal agency requires that. And an example of a federal agency requiring programmatic certification is the Federal Aviation Administration. So if you have a flight school, the Federal Aviation Administration has to approve of the flight school. But most of your programs, it would be a state requirement if it's needed at all. Third, the program meets any applicable educational prerequisites for professional licensure or certification requirements in the state. This is all tied to the state in which the school is located. And four, that the program is not substantially similar to a program where the debt to earning rates were failing or in the zone. So if you have a failing rate and the program becomes ineligible and was discontinued, either it became ineligible or it was voluntarily discontinued by the school, then there's a waiting period. And so you have to say that this new program is not substantially similar in order to certify it on your EAP and give Title IV aid for it. And again, these certifications are renewed when you're recertified, when you add a program, or something materially changes. Another example of a material change is that a few years ago, Pennsylvania changed the requirements for certification in the state for radiologists. So they said in order to get a license to practice radiology in the state of Pennsylvania, you now had to have an associate's degree. Even to, sit for the test, they wouldn't even consider giving you a license without that. So programs that had been giving out certificates now had to have at least an associate's degree. And so all of those schools, and luckily, unlike some states, they actually gave them a little bit of time to adjust their programs before the new rules went into effect. And so yay, Pennsylvania, for doing that one right. So the schools adjusted their programs. And now they were associate degree programs. Well, then they'd need to do a new certification in order to say that they met the new requirements. And there's a couple of ways you can do this new certification. You can either do the same transitional certification process that you did back in December of 2015, or you can put it in question 69 of your EAP and send in the signature page that you have to send in anyway when you make changes to your e-car. And here's just a little more information about when you'd need to do a new certification. And on an ongoing basis, the department's going to monitor this to make sure all the certifications are accurate and complete. So here's some helpful links specifically on certification. We have electronic announcement number 77 is particularly helpful because that talks about what to do in this when you're making changes and how to put it on your EAP and where to send the signature page and all that stuff. So that's a good one if you're making changes. The other thing is the GE certification at ed.gov email. We have an email box specifically for certification questions, and a great group of our program compliance staff helps with answering some of those. So if you have issues related to certification, that is where you would go. And throughout this presentation, I've been giving some resources and talking about your colleague letters, electronic announcements. All of the stuff related to gainful employment is on the IFAP website under the information pages. Gainful employment's the second one down. You can see a red box with the arrow on the right-hand side. Early FAFSA has beat us out, so that one's the first one. But now gainful employment's right there, number 2. So anything related to gainful employment is going to be right there. I also want to point out the My IFAP link on the other side. So the Department of Education expects y'all to keep up with an incredible amount of information and puts things out on IFAP on a regular basis that you're supposed to keep up with. The My IFAP is the best way to do that. You can sign up to get either a weekly or daily email sent to your email box, and as many people on your campus who want to can do this. It will send you everything that's new that was posted that week in an email, and then you can just, run down the list, say, oh, I need to know about gainful employment, or I need to know about 150%, or I need to know about whatever, COD processing deadlines, whatever it is, and then click on those, and it takes you directly to that electronic announcement or notice or dear colleague letter or whatever it is. So I highly recommend that you guys do that. I have mine set up for weekly. But if you can't wait a whole week, there's the daily one too. So we didn't go over the disclosure information very much in this presentation. We wanted to spend a little more time on that one, so we're doing a whole separate presentation. And actually, the first one is immediately after this down in Exhibit Hall A3. So hopefully some of y'all will follow me down there in order to ask your questions about gainful employment and find out more information about that. So we'll take some questions now. I do want to mention, if we run out of time for questions today, one of my staff members is sitting at the NSLDS table in the resource room, and she can answer gainful employment questions as well. So if you have a gainful employment question that we're unable to get to today, at the NSLDS table, she's there and she can help answer those questions. And if you do have a question, there's 2 microphones set up here in the middle of the room. If you can come up and say your name and what school or organization you are with, I'll be happy to take questions.
At this point, all you can challenge is the loan information. At some point, is there going to be an opportunity to challenge the earnings information?
Thank you. Very good question. So you don't actually, there is an opportunity to, quote, challenge the earnings information that we got from Social Security Administration. However, there is an opportunity to do an alternate earnings appeal. And also, if you go to the resource section of the IFAP page, there's a whole bunch of information about the 2 options for an alternate earnings appeal. It's a state data system or a survey, and there's all sorts of rules and requirements about how to do the survey. How to do all that.
The survey would be the students in the cohort.
Yes, you would survey all of the students in the cohort, and you have to get it certified by a CPA.
Right.
That there's a lot of requirements.
Right, but
Yes.
The Social Security information, correct me if I'm wrong, that only represents what somebody reports on their W-2.
No, you get, it's more than that. It includes earnings, but it also includes, and it's been a couple years since I've gone through all of this. It's everything. It includes all earnings. It's in,
Okay, but if...
John, do you remember, I know because it's independent contractors have to report into there. There's a whole lot of stuff that it covers. Try, he says it's good. Try again.
It's supposed to be on. Hello?
Yeah.
This one's on? It's any information reported to the IRS that goes back to SSA. So it
But
includes more than W-2 income.
Okay, but it's my understanding if you have your own small corporation, an S corporation.
It's any information reported to the IRS. I'm going to have to go on to the next question, but it
Okay.
is pretty complete. And let's do the one in the back, and then I'll get to you, Sharon.
This is a certification question on frequency of updating your PPA. If the number of units in a program change, say they change one of the courses and it increases it by 3 units or decreases it by 1, Do you have to update that PPA?
It depends if it's a substantial change, like would the accreditor have to relook at it again, or is it a very minor change? Probably there's also in the resource room is an eligibility table with some of our really good program compliance staff there, so that might be a better question for them. But my understanding is it has to be a substantial change before you'd have to change it on your e-car. So one credit probably wouldn't be enough, but if you're changing it a lot, then it would be.
Okay, thank you.
Sharon Bob Powers. Could you clarify the issue of being able to adjust the Title IV amount by cancellations and refunds? Because many people are interpreting refunds as anything you return under return of Title IV.
So there is a frequently asked question that directly relates to this. Refunds isn't necessarily what you return under return of Title IV. If the student still owes you the money, let's see, if the student still owes you the money, then that's not institutional debt.
No, I'm talking about
trying to
Title
think through.
IV.
Right,
For challenge purposes. That schools are making sure that if they returned Title IV because a student withdrew, of course that wouldn't apply if they're completers, but that it's not what you returned to FELP, which no one is returning now. It's what you returned to direct loans when someone...
Which I think is counted as a cancellation.
Well, it could be after 120 days.
It really doesn't matter. It's the amount that the student owes at the time they completed the program.
Not for
Well, no, for
Title
Title
IV? No.
For Title IV.
Title IV?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
You're thinking
I'm sorry, I'm talking institutional
Yeah,
debt.
yeah. Okay.
Forget it.
Say that, you're right.
I knew we'd get in trouble anytime we answer a Sharon Bob question. But getting back to it, if the school makes a downward adjustment to the loan amount, then that counts.
Yeah, it counts as a cancellation. So, in the back?
Hi, I have a couple of questions related to this one scenario. I've got a new program that only has 4 students in the cohort, so it doesn't qualify for the GE metrics right now, but we got the earnings data for those 4 particular students, and it all came back as 0.
You did
But-
not get earnings information for those 4 particular students. You had to have at least 10
Okay.
in the cohort. So if you're seeing a 0, it's because it should have been an NA. We didn't get earnings data back.
Okay, so you have to have 10 people in the cohort to get an earnings data.
Correct.
Okay. All right, and I guess that answers a couple questions. And my last one is, if you go through the alternative earnings appeal, there's several things that go through that you have to, but the last one, I think it's on page 34, says any other information that might be required by the secretary. Do you have any guidance on what that might be? That seems kind of like a catch-all phrase. After you do the REGI server and you get the information certified by a CPA, for example.
Right now, we haven't specified anything, but if, as we're reviewing your appeal, there's some question that we have, we might ask for some additional documentation.
Okay, do you have any particular timeline that might, like if you have a 45-day window and I submit it on day 1?
So
Day 40
the
comes
alternate
along.
earnings appeals are not due during this 45-day window.
Oh, I know, I'm talking about like in the future when.
So
when you
in the
do do it.
future, you have to tell us you're going to do the appeal within 15 days, and then you have 60 days to give us all of your documentation, and we will start processing it as soon as we get it. And there isn't a timeline for like when that gets finalized.
Okay,
So as long as you get everything to us that's specified in there, minus the information we haven't specified to tell you exactly what we need yet. If you, give us the certification, the information, all that stuff, get that to us within those 60 days, then, we
Okay.
analyze it, accept it, reject it, talk to you about it, whatever it is, to work on those. I will make one mention of something related to alternate earnings appeals. You only do an alternate earnings appeals if it's going to help your program score enough to actually move it up a rung. So if you're going from a fail to a higher fail, you don't need to bother submitting that to us. It has to go either from a fail to a zone or a pass, or from a zone to a pass. So if it doesn't move up enough to go to the next tier, then you don't submit an alternate earnings appeal.
Okay, can I ask one more question? Those 4 students I was just talking about, when the next year rolls around, we'll get more students. And if we do have 30 in that cohort, will those original 4 be included in there for the earnings data? If not, and it goes to the following 3rd year?
If,
Do you understand what
so
I'm
the
saying?
students, if the students are in either the 2-year or the 4-year cohort, and each year it moves up 1 year, so if they're in the 4-year cohort, then those 4 students might be included.
Okay, and you will, at that point, you pull the earnings data from the most recent year, depending on when
Correct.
those 4 are on there. Okay, thank you.
In the front?
Excuse me. My name is Colleen Russo. I'm with ECM. We're a third-party servicer. Could you maybe give some examples of why something would come back from the Social Security Administration as unmatched? In the reading that I did, and I think in the webinars, they seem to be referring to a match of identity, name, Social Security, date of birth. So I'm making the assumption that since we, not we, but as schools know the correct combination of name, Social Security number, and date of birth because it's gone
You would
through
hope
the
so.
central processing system. So I'm assuming we're submitting those things correctly. What is mismatching?
So there's very few of them that mismatch. We have a 99% match rate. There's very few of them that'll mismatch. We don't know exactly which students did the mismatch.
Right.
We did find this time that during the corrections process, schools were able to add in students that we then didn't match up with NSLDS data. And some schools reported non-Title IV students, which they should not have done. But we didn't know they were a non-Title IV student because the other time where we would have, it's a Title IV student, but we wouldn't have it in NSLDS is if they were a work-study only student. So we thought they were work-study only students. We submitted them. A lot of those came back as non-matches. They were non-Title IV students, or they submitted school IDs instead of Social Security numbers. But in general, vast majority of the programs, you might have one. You're really not going to have a whole lot of mismatches.
Okay, so if I had one particular school that had a list, for a particular program, had a list of maybe 150 students and 60 of them came back mismatched.
They probably
your
had a
assumption would
reporting
be
area
that
if it was
the
60 out of,
school
if you
did
have
something
60 out of
wrong.
150, there's probably a reporting error there because that's highly unlikely. The other reason is you'd be surprised how many students do not actually know their legal names. And they give the school some name that does not match with Social Security Administration. And this is not, we're not talking Peggy versus Margaret. We're talking, they have some other name or they misspell their own names or something and it comes back as a mismatch.
Yeah, and again, we would normally resolve that, during the initial eligibility checks with, running through the central processing system. I started to
Absolutely.
think, are none of the employers collecting documentation to prove who they're really hiring? Are they giving the wrong number, the wrong name, or the wrong Social Security number to the employer? And that's
Yeah.
how it's getting?
I don't know. That particular one, I'd love to see which OPEID SIP code credential level that one was, because that is a very unusual number of mismatches. In the back?
Yeah, for the calculation, I think you said the interest rate was 6.5%,
It's 6.8%.
6.8%. Will that be going down in the future?
It could, yes. So we do a fairly complicated thing of the average of the statutory unsub rate for a number of years. And so it has fluctuated and sometimes goes down. It's all 6.8 all across the board for this time. But next year, I think for the medical dental residencies, when you go back, it drops a little bit, and then 2 or 3 years from now, it'll drop because the unsub rate was a little different.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Stan Freeman from Powers. The guidance says that for nonprofit institutions that offer a degree program but also offer a certificate or diploma along the way, that the program would not be considered a GE program if a substantial number of the students matriculate on to the degree program. And I'm just curious whether the department has a particular benchmark in mind. Is that a substantial number of students? Does that mean more than just 1 or 2? Does it mean the
You
majority?
should go sit down. You don't want me to answer that question. John, do you want to address?
No, well, we don't have a specific threshold, and I don't know that we'll actually put one out, but we'll have to consider each case as we see it. But the circumstance that we're talking about, though, that you're talking about, is that the student is actually enrolled in a degree program, and they get a certificate along the way. And the only thing we want to protect against is that the enrollment occurs to circumvent the GE rule, because they're really only intending to complete the certificate program. So that's why we have this cautionary note that most students who enroll are really enrolled in that in the degree program, and we expect, those students to complete that program at a higher rate than just getting the GE certificate. So I haven't seen any cases yet about it, and we're unlikely to publish any specific guidelines on it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, question on the challenge process for the DE rates. If you have a program that was calculated as passing, can you submit a challenge on that, or is it only for failing or in the zone programs?
So you could submit a challenge, but your program's passing, so I'm not sure why it doesn't get any better than passing. But
If
you
the rate
could.
seems higher to the threshold, is there any reason to go back and review and submit a challenge on that if you find incorrect information?
It is up to you. The only other thing I would keep in mind is that the Title IV debt, you're only fixing it in the frozen file. So if you think it's actually wrong, you might want to work with the servicer to get it corrected in the general NSLDS so that our data is overall correct, and therefore that would be reflected the following year. But there's nothing that prohibits you from doing a challenge if you have the documentation that the loan amounts or loan periods or something are incorrect. So you could do it.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I am very jealous of your gloves.
Oh, I planned ahead. Christy from Makeup Designery. I had a question. We did our transitional certification by December last year, and just this past Monday, we received our updated e-card just for adding a third-party servicer. There were no changes to our Gainful Employment program. Do we have to do the certification again?
No, there were no
Okay.
changes to your actual programs, so
Okay.
no.
Great. One more question. We did make corrections during the correction period to our completers list. And I'm just wondering, is that going to reflect negatively on us at some point? Are you guys, because the information was supposed to be correct to begin with, and we, submitted corrections to the data that was originally supposed to be correct? And
No.
okay, because you're allowing us to make
I
corrections.
would
so-
ask you to go back and make sure that the underlying data in NSLDS is also correct.
We did,
Because
yes.
it just fixed it in the one place. Yeah, definitely not this year. I mean, a lot of it is, when we did those 5 years worth of data, it was the first time you were doing reporting on GE. It was 5 years worth of data. It was older data. It was harder than normal. And so some schools got it wrong. So, no.
Okay, thank you.
Let's answer your question. Any other questions? All right, well, this is where I'm going to be at 12:05 p.m. in Exhibit Hall A3. So if you would like to come see the Gainful Employment Disclosure presentation, please join me there.